Adding Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons tells us the Falcons are no longer complacent, but how high exactly will this defense climb now that they've arrived?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for nearly 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong in this illustrious podcast, and I think each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we'll talk about Matthew Judon wanting to earn a new contract and the sort of good and bad that comes with that. We'll talk about why the Falcons are going to still be reliant on some young players to step up if this defense is going to reach their ceiling. But, of course, we'll start with, the additions of Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons, raising the floor of this defense, which we've talked about before. And, we like to focus more on floors here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, not necessarily ceilings. But despite that, we always talk about, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And that typically refers more to the ceiling than the floor. But you got to start somewhere. And so I think these guys are definitely going to help raise the floor for the Falcons defense because you're going to get more stability. We've talked before about part of the reason why I believe that the Falcons defense was as consistent as it was and as capable as it was in 2023 was because of the reliance on veteran players. And part of the inconsistency of the offense was the reliance on a lot of young, unproven guys. And, I think Judon and Simmons give you those steady veteran presences that will be able to help stabilize things on that side of the ball. But I thought it was interesting, that, you had Kay Adams in Flowery Branch today to watch Falcons practice. And she talked to Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris about the additions of Judon and Simmons. And Terry mentioned that, they had talked about adding Justin Simmons earlier in the offseason, sort of pushing back against the idea that, these were sort of spur of the moment decisions made post injuries to DeMarco Hellams and Braylon Trice. I tend to be very cynical, and I personally think cynicism comes with the territory of being a Falcon fan for over 30 years. But, I feel like, of course, you talked about it, Terry, before, but why did you wait so long if this was potentially on the agenda earlier in the offseason? Because I think it's interesting because, Raheem talked about on Monday sort of an acclimation period for both Judon and Simmons to get those guys up to speed. And he sort of expressed that he wasn't necessarily concerned with, any worries about those guys not being ready to compete come week one. But again, it's one of those things where it's like, all right, but why wait if these moves were always, possibilities, that there's really no benefit to waiting as long as the Falcons did, in terms of that. So I'm not really buying that. Again, I'm sure Terry did, of course, talk to these guys, beforehand, or they had conversations about signing these guys, but, there was no real momentum until the Hellams and Trice injuries to really get the deals done. And I know some of you guys are like, well, Aaron, why are you so obsessed with, whether or not this move was a reaction to those injuries? Because I personally think it's important context when it comes to these moves, right? And it's not meant to take shots at the Falcons. It's more meant to kind of praise the Falcons by contrasting sort of, the path that they were on and now the path that they were previously on versus the path that they're currently on, right? Because it's a real shift in perspective, right? For 5 months, they were basically operating like, they were a quarterback away. That was the path that they were on. And now their shift seems to be like, hey, yeah, we probably have a couple more issues that we probably need to address. And so now we need to kind of make the moves now, because if we wait even longer, it's going to be a problem. Now, again, my personal opinion is like they waited 5 months too long. But again, maybe that's just a part of me that has to produce daily content on this football team. And so, that content in March would have just hit just a little bit harder if they had made these moves then. But, beggars can't be choosers, as I often say. But, this is one instance where we go results over process, right? Don't love the process, but hey, if you got the right results, we'll take it. But, to me, like that shift, that change, that, we can contrast it to last year, right? Where, we spent all last offseason, this offseason we spent it being like, where's the pass rush coming from? And last offseason we were like, hey, are we going to sign a new wide receiver? Because I don't know if Matt Collins is going to be the answer at wide receiver 2, right? Now, that will work if you have a dominant run game, if you can, run your offense through Bijan Robinson and Drake London and Kyle Pitts, right? And if you don't need anybody else in order to facilitate offense on a consistent and weekly basis, then yeah, Matt Collins is a perfectly fine option if he's only ever going to have to be, the fourth or fifth option, or really, the fifth option after Tyler Algier in your offense, right? He can be functional in that role if you're getting all that you want from the top 4 options, right? But because Kyle Pitts was injured and so therefore couldn't sort of carry his weight, the run game regressed, and so Bijan and Algier couldn't carry their weight. And then your quarterback play wasn't quite up to par. And so arguably Drake London couldn't do the things that he needed to do in order for your top 4 offense to click that season. You couldn't really run your offense to the degree that you could, and you needed more out of Matt Collins, and you needed more juice. And that's where the whole like, hey, the Falcons should add someone like a Corey Davis. This is what we talked about on the podcast. Like there are going to be times when those guys aren't clicking and you're going to need someone else to step up. And I don't think Matt Collins is that guy. And I think Corey Davis or Hunter Renfrow or whoever is more of that, could potentially be the solution to that problem. And the Falcons eventually realized this, right? And that's where the Van Jefferson trade came in. But that wound up being too little too late. That contributed to the dismissal of that coaching staff because they weren't able to really solve that problem. And so while I can sit here and say that the Falcons took their sweet time adding Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons, they did it at a point in the offseason where it can still make a discernible difference on their upcoming season, unlike waiting till week 6 to make the Van Jefferson trade. Now, obviously, Raheem Morris isn't on the hot seat like Arthur Smith was last year, but, success in 2024 is really, whatever the Falcons do in 2024 is really going to set the tone for what the entirety of Raheem Morris's tenure is going to be in a lot of ways. And, there's so many people out there that are just chomping at the bit to want to second guess this team, right? Whether it's the hiring of Raheem Morris over someone like a Bill Belichick, whether it's the signing of Kirk Cousins and paying that premium at the quarterback position for a older quarterback coming off an injury versus going cheap like Pittsburgh did by going after Justin Fields and Russell Wilson. A lot of people want to second guess that decision. A lot of people want to second guess the decision to draft Michael Penix over a pass rusher, right? Going for the future rather than getting someone that can help you out immediately, right? The whole notion that Raheem said after that pick was like, we're not going to be picking this high. Oh, you don't know how many people would love to throw that back in Raheem Morris's face, right? You think the Lamar Jackson stuff is going to go away if the Falcons don't achieve their goals this season and miss the playoffs? Like, you don't think there's going to be people like they paid Kirk Cousins $180 million and they weren't willing to take a look at Lamar Jackson? There's going to be plenty of those people out there in the woodwork. And I don't bring those things up to be negative. I just bring those things up to basically illustrate that there is a golden opportunity for growth here. There is the end of complacency here in Atlanta due to these additions, right? And it's certainly possible at some point in the future that we're looking back at this past week of moves that the Falcons made as a real sort of turning point for this regime and this franchise. And so that to me is kind of representative of the type of potential impact that these moves could wind up having in the short term, and also potentially changing the trajectory of this team in terms of the long term. So we'll see on that front. But speaking of potential impact, let's talk about the ceiling of the Falcons defense with Judon and Simmons sort of setting the floor, right? What is the ceiling based off of? And I think that's still going to rely heavily on some young, unproven players on the defensive side of the ball stepping up, like Richie Grant, like Troy Andersen, like, Arnold Ebiketie, et cetera, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So you've heard me talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, but there's something a little different for you now, because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. And with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game, and all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. And while you're there, why not check out the action on the upcoming Falcons-Steelers Week 1 game? The line has already moved, right? It was 2.5 yesterday, with the Falcons being favored by 2.5 points. Now it's Falcons are favored by 3 points. So take advantage before the line moves even further, right? If you thought the Falcons would win on a field goal, now that's not going to win you anything if you waited till today. So take advantage now, or, don't wait to see that line move in terms of Georgia winning the national championship at plus 280, right? Take those odds now. So don't wait. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Take advantage of this offer for NFL Sunday Ticket. Take advantage of all the offers over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So, guys, before we talk about the Falcons' defensive ceiling, I want to plug the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast, where you can get insight into all the risers, fallers, etc. And as you build your draft board to win your league this year, Locked On Fantasy Football is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So basically, I think Judon and Simmons really set the floor for this defense. Again, they provide stability, right? That consistent veteran presence is going to stabilize things, while relying on youth, as the Falcons seemingly were prior to these moves, was going to bring probably a lot more volatility and variance into things, right? It's a lower floor, but if those things hit, it does raise your ceiling. And I think when we talk about how good this defense can be now that they've added these pieces, it's still going to be heavily determined by a lot of these young pieces, like Richie Grant, like Troy Andersen, like whoever lines up at outside corner opposite AJ Terrell, who's going to be that edge rusher opposite Matthew Judon now, right? And I know it made some waves on Twitter because Raheem Morris in his Monday presser talked about how, now we have 3 good safeties, like we have 3 good linebackers, right, with Richie Grant and Justin Simmons and Jesse Bates. And, I saw a lot of people on Twitter being like, 3 good, basically taking shots at Richie Grant and being like, but I think what people, the Falcons are going to still need Richie Grant, right? Because you're not asking Justin Simmons and Jesse Bates to be these tight end erasers. Richie Grant is still going to take a lot of that responsibility to cover tight ends, right? And so you still need 3 safety because, while Simmons and Bates are certainly capable when it comes to coverage, like that's not what they do best, right? If you want to put those guys in a position to succeed, it's not going out there and being basically saying, hey, go lock down Travis Kelce, go lock down Pat Freiermuth or Dallas Goedert or Brock Bowers, right? Or TJ Hawkinson or whoever. It's, go and roam around the secondary, Jesse, do your thing, as we know he likes to do, step out and make some plays, right? That's really what you need from those guys. And so part of that for me is like, I'm not as down on Richie Grant as maybe other people are. I think he stepped up his play in the second half of last season. I don't think it's a coincidence that was during the time where you started to see more of DeMarco Hellams and Richie Grant was kind of relegated to being more of that dime safety, right? I think that's kind of the best usage of him. And I think adding a player like Simmons will allow you to get better usage out of Richie Grant. We'll see if he plays more like the player he was in the second half of the season after the bye week, or are we going to see more of the front half of the season, now that he's going to be more of a full-time dime safety as opposed to a full-time starter. But I think, that's going to do a lot because Richie Grant's going to be a big part of your ability to cover tight ends. Another player that's going to be a big part of your ability to cover tight ends is going to be Troy Andersen. Troy Andersen not only is going to help you in terms of covering the tight ends, he's going to be potentially more of that guy that you can say, hey, go lock down that, opposing tight end, that high Pro Bowl caliber tight end or whatnot, more so than you're asking Simmons, Bates, or Richie Grant to do those things, as well as being able to cover some of the dynamic running backs that you're going to face in the passing game, like an Austin Eckler, like a Saquon Barkley, like an Alvin Kamara, and all that sort of stuff. Not to mention the mobile quarterbacks that you're going to see this year. If Justin Fields wins the Steelers starting quarterback job, that's going to be a challenge. Jalen Hurts. Patrick Mahomes is not a runner, but he's certainly a guy that can extend plays outside the pocket, and you need that guy that can sort of go on a beeline and take him down and force those throwaways rather than the usual Mahomes magic where he's, late in the down, he's tossing, 50-yard bombs to Xavier Worthy because he was able to get behind the defense, or Mark Hollywood Brown, or whatever that the case may be. So, that's going to be a big part of it, right? Like, all of those things were areas of weakness for the Falcons. The Falcons struggled covering tight ends. They struggled covering running backs last year. We saw them struggle many times against mobile quarterbacks like Justin Fields, like Kyler Murray, Josh Dobbs. Do you think there's a coincidence that Troy Andersen missed all this time and the Falcons struggled with those things? Because, again, this is part of my anti-Nate Landman agenda, right? But, like, to me, having Nate Landman on the field, and this to me is the part that often gets overlooked by folks when they talk about the Falcons defense, is, to me, part of that agenda is because I really do think Nate Landman, like, the Falcons had to spend so much energy trying to hide Nate Landman on their defense and not put him in a position where he would automatically fail. And that didn't allow them to put other players, because other players had to kind of pick up the slack. You had to use Caden Ellis more as a coverage guy rather than the pass rusher. You had to use Richie Grant as your sole, sort of tight end eraser last year due to Ryan Nielsen's desire to play a lot of man coverage. And you weren't going to ask Nate Landman to have to cover all of those guys. And that put Richie Grant in a position where he got exposed too often at that point in time. And so this is why, like, we'll see what Troy Andersen winds up being this year. Again, is Troy Andersen going to solve all these problems? We'll see. But he at least has the capacity and the capability of potentially solving those problems. And if he can solve those problems, all of a sudden, the mobile quarterbacks, the tight ends, the running backs, all these various things that were, preventing you from reaching your full potential as a defense last year, you're going to be able to match up in those ways. And that's going to allow you to slow down the high-end offenses that can present those challenges. All of a sudden, Jaden Hurts' legs or Jaden Daniels' legs are no longer a factor against you because you have a playmaker like Troy Andersen in the middle of your defense able to make plays, right? And so it gets to the other areas that need to step up. That other edge other than Matthew Judon, right? That guy's going to get a lot of one-on-ones, right? With Judon and Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. Will they be able to win those one-on-ones, right? For example, like you go to the week 5 game against the Bucs, right? If I'm the Falcons, like, I'm not putting Matthew Judon against Tristan Wirfs in that game, right? I'm going to put Matthew Judon against, Luke Gadecki, who's a perfectly capable right tackle, but, like, I'm not going to put my best guy on their best guy, right? This is what we kind of talked about this offseason in the pre-draft process with Laiatu Latu. Like, Laiatu Latu was rarely facing the best of the Pac-12 offensive linemen. He was often facing the worst of the Pac-12 offensive linemen, which I think led to his production looking, more spectacular than it probably would be translating to the NFL level. But we'll see on that front. But, like, I've never seen basically all that. Like, I've never seen Tristan. I don't know if I've ever seen in 4 years Tristan Wirfs in like 8 games that he's played against. Has he ever given up a pressure? I don't know. He probably has against the Falcons, but I can't recall a moment where I was watching film and like, yeah, that guy beat Tristan Wirfs. It's like, no, like, and so, like, you're, again, you can of course trust on Matt Judon to, terrorize Luke Gadecki and Grady and David Onyemata to terrorize the interior of that Bucs offensive line, and that's going to do wonders for your defense. But what's going to take your defense to another level? If you do have another guy in that matchup that is going to be facing a lot more of Tristan Wirfs, if an Arnold Ebiketie, if a Lorenzo Carter, whoever that is, can actually cause problems for that type of offensive tackle. That's going to raise the ceiling for your defense, right? Where it's not just 3 guys that are doing all the heavy lifting. That 4th guy can bring some weight to bear. It's the same thing with the outside cornerback spot, right? Mike Hughes is expected to be the starter there, right? And the hope with Mike Hughes is that he's going to be sort of that low variance player, right? He's going to be a safer option than someone like a Clark Phillips, right? Because he's going to be able to make the plays and run support that you need that player to make, as well as not give up the explosive plays on the back end that you want to make. Again, I think that's a fair. I think the run support stuff, you have less concerns about Mike Hughes than you do Clark Phillips, but the explosiveness is something that, we have to sort of see with Mike Hughes. But that's why it goes back to something we talked about yesterday with Natron Brooks, right? Natron Brooks kind of showed you what it's supposed to look like in the Ravens game, preseason game, what it's supposed to look like when that cornerback is doing his job. But at the same time, like, that's only really setting the floor for your defense. If you're going to take that to the ceiling, right? You want that corner not only to be able to do all the stuff and run support, to not give up the explosive plays, but also to make those impact plays, create those turnovers and whatnot, break up those throws and whatnot. And that's, I think, where someone like a Clark Phillips, that's where a lot of people are more intrigued, because I certainly would agree with most folks that Clark Phillips is going to offer you more upside as far as the coverage goes than probably what Mike Hughes is going to do. But maybe Mike Hughes is going to be a more consistent. And, I think it's fair to wonder, like, would that be better for the Falcons defense now that you've sort of set the floor with, solidified the floor, I guess you could say, a little bit more with Matthew Judon and Judon Simmons? Is this now the time where it's like, okay, we'll be more willing to roll the dice on someone like a Clark Phillips, even if it's going to introduce a little bit more variance into our defense, just because we're not as worried about variance now as we may have been prior to those moves. So those are going to be the questions I have about this Falcons defense. Will we get those young players to step up? It's still going to matter this upcoming season, right? Adding Judon, adding Simmons doesn't mean that those players still aren't going to have a big impact on the team. But if those players don't step up, it's going to be less detrimental to the team, because you have those stabilizing forces like Judon, because you can still get pressure on the quarterback. You still should have very capable safety play from Judon Simmons. And so that's what I mean, where it's like they set the floor and these young guys are going to help set the ceiling. And so we'll see how high this Falcons defense can climb, especially if several of those young guys, in addition to all the pieces that they have up front, the Zach Harrisons, the Ruka Roros, the Brandon Dolis, the Quan Grahams, etc., how those guys step up as well. So we'll find out this upcoming season just how high this Falcons defense can climb. But certainly I think people should feel a lot better about at least having that sort of stability on that side of the ball now with these two veteran additions. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking a little bit more about Matt Judon and his future in Atlanta, and the fact that he wants to earn a contract. And I think there's good and bad that comes with that. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's lock. So one of the things that Matthew Judon said at his introductory press conference was that he's not pressing the Falcons to pay him, and he wants to sort of earn the contract that he's going to get here in Atlanta. And that goes back to something when we made the trade, sort of the expectation at that time was, well, we're going to have to pay him. That's what happens when you make these trades for the guys. We saw this with Bradley Chubb in Miami a couple of years ago, and Montez Sweat last year in Chicago. And that's the root behind all the Hassan Reddick drama, not only in Philadelphia, but also now with the Jets. And so the expectation was like, we trade for Judon, we pay him, but that's not going to be the situation. He's going to earn that contract at some point in time. So I think there's good and bad that comes with that. I think the good is obviously you save some money in the short term, right? You don't have to commit, 19 million or 20 million or whatever in guaranteed money this year, next year, whatever, to Matthew Judon. That's money that you could save. I think the bad of that potentially opens the door for you to have to pay more in the long term, right? We've talked before about this trade in terms of edges start to slow down at the age that Matthew Judon is now, just turned 32 last week, right? And we talked before on a podcast about how several examples, whether we're looking at Von Miller or Cameron Jordan or Brandon Graham, of older veteran edge rushers, there tends to be a slowdown between the ages of 32 and 34, right? And so, for me, making this trade with Matthew Judon, because he's now 32, like I felt comfortable with what Judon's going to bring in 24 and potentially in 25 when he's at age 32 and 33. But if you're going to defer that payment, are you going to potentially be paying him in age 34 seasons in 2026 and beyond, right? And the contrast to that is maybe you don't pay Matthew Judon after the season. And if you're renting him for one season, that's fine, right? That's going to lead to a conversation about whether or not it was worthwhile to give up a third-round pick for that. Given Terry Fontenot's track record of drafting third-round picks, it's hard to argue that 1 year of Matthew Judon isn't better than the outcomes that you've gotten with some of those third-round picks over the last 4 years. But, if Judon does walk next offseason, despite all the praise that we've given Uncle Terry this week, go check out, was it yesterday? Friday's episode for more context on the Uncle Terry stuff. But, it does worry you a little bit, because it means that we're right back to where we started in terms of whether or not the Falcons have solved their pass rush. Now, again, maybe if Arnold Ebiketie goes out there and has a monster year, you feel a little bit better about that. But at the same time, if Arnold Ebiketie does have that monster year, you're probably sitting there, or at least I am. I don't know how many of you guys are worried about this, but I'm worried about this. Is this a Dwight Freeney, Vic Beasley situation where it's like, oh, you benefited from Matthew Judon's presence, and if we take that away, are you going to fall back down to earth a little bit? And you saw this last year with the 4 games. I think Matthew Judon was healthy. Like Josh Uche had like 2 out of his 3 sacks and like some ridiculous amount of pressures. It was averaging like 4 or 5 pressures a game, and then in the games where Judon wasn't there, both of those numbers really tanked. He still was an effective pressure guy, but it wasn't to the same degree that he was in the first month of the season. And so you basically, all that to say is, we'll be sitting here, next offseason wondering about being in the same place for the Falcons pass rush. And it's like, we still haven't solved the problem, right? And we're still wondering, Uncle Terry, when are you going to solve it, right? That'll be year 5 going into next offseason. And it's fine if you give him the pass for like the first 2 years of not necessarily solving it, but still, it's been a while, right? And, sustained success in this league really hinges on solving problems, right? I've constantly used the Kansas City Chiefs as an example, obviously because they're the most successful team in the NFL over the last, 6-7 years. And a lot of that is often owed, not incorrectly, but often I think it's exaggerated how much of that is just simply Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. Again, the whole coach and quarterback, it becomes easy for people to say that. But, what the Chiefs have done over the last, 4 or 5 years has really done a great job solving other problems when they spring up, right? That when they had the offensive line issues in that 2020 Super Bowl against the Buccaneers, immediately they went out and brought in 4 new starters, and they instantly went from a bad offensive line to one of the best in the league. You saw the defensive issues that somewhat got exposed, not to a huge degree, but certainly, the Bengals challenged them in that 21 playoff run when the Bengals went to the Super Bowl, and then they immediately invested a lot of resources in draft picks on the defense side of the ball in that 22 draft, and they've had basically a top 10 defense ever since then. And so, like, that's what we mean when we're talking about, the Chiefs. Again, why the Chiefs are able to sustain success is not simply because of Mahomes and Andy Reid. They're a big part of this. It's like, let's say there's 51% of their success, but the other 49% is their nearly instantaneous ability to solve other problems when other problems bring themselves up. And so that's going to be a question with Terry Fontenot in the future, right? Especially if we're so heavily reliant on Grady Jarrett and Matthew Judon and David Onyemata to solve their pass rush issues, right? We've invested a lot of assets in young pass rushers over the last 4 drafts, but so far none of those have quite hit. Now maybe this year that changes, and I don't bring this up to complain or anything like that. I know you guys just think, hey, Aaron, you just constantly are complaining about something, and because you can't complain about that anymore, with the Judon and Simmons additions, you got to complain about something else. And it's like, well, first of all, fair, but like, if I'm not complaining about something, are you really listening to Locked On Falcons is basically what I'm getting at. But, it is an interesting conversation about that whole sort of situation. So that's what Judon not signing a contract to me raises those questions. Again, how it's going to play out. He could easily play great this year, earn a new contract, and play well and be that guy that's playing well at 34, 35 and beyond. Right? I think Cameron Wake still had a double-digit sack season at age 36 or something like that. So it's not impossible for guys to be impactful players beyond the age of 32. But it is one of those things where it's just like, you do wonder a little bit, are we back in the same boat? And the whole like Terry thing, like that's why like I always say, like, I'm going to hold my applause to the end, because I want to see him permanently solve this pass rush issue, right? And if it's just renting Judon for 1 year or 2, you still need those draft picks to pay off, right? And we talk about the opportunity costs, right, of going in different directions. Whether we're talking about taking Penix this year, taking Drake London 2 years ago, when a lot of people thought they should take Jermaine Johnson or another pass rusher, taking Bijan over Jalen Carter a couple of years ago, right? And it's like, it's a trade-off, right? Where it's just like, if you're getting top 10 offensive play while the pass rush is not quite living up to what you want it to be, like, is that a fair trade-off? Again, I think I would argue yes. But if you're not getting, again, we'll see how that all plays out. But it is just, to me, an interesting conversation in terms of, like, Uncle Terry's gotten a lot of praise this week, as he should, for buying us a pony. But we'll see. We'll see ultimately whether or not it all pays off, if he can start to solve some of these issues that we're talking about. So we'll see. We'll see on that. But if you want to find out, more about my thoughts on the Matthew Judon signing, why not go become a Locked On Falcons insider by clicking the link in the description below, where you can get a 30-minute video film breakdown of some of Matthew Judon and what he's going to bring to the pass rush from the 2023 season, going through his film last year to see what he's adding to Atlanta. And of course, you can sign up for free right now by clicking that link in the description at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You get a 14-day free trial. Then it's $4.99 a month after that point. So you sign up now, get through those 14 days, and we'll be on the verge of the regular season starting, and then you'll get access to the extended all 22 reviews at that point. And so it's a great deal for you. So check that out at the link in the description below. If you want to find out more information on Matthew Judon, next one we're planning on doing is a Justin Simmons breakdown. So hopefully that will be coming out in the next few days as part of that 14-day free trial if you're new, sign up. So go check that out in the link in the description below. Guys, it's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.